How the Jews Betrayed Mankind, Volume 1, The Sumerian Swindle, 2nd edition by G_D, continuing with Chapter 6, Subchapter 3000 BC Bronze Age Sumerian Civilization. As the year 3000 BC dawned, the new invention of writing coincided with many other inventions and discoveries both from Sumerian genius as well as from the peoples living in distant countries. This era was also the approximate beginning of the Bronze Age, where men could set aside their brittle implements of obsidian and flint and their bendable tools of copper, and could make use of a stronger alloy. For the first time, bronze could be used for all of the tools and weapons that less durable metals had been an inadequate substitute. By mixing copper and tin in their furnaces, this new metal alloy gave mankind tough materials for his religious sculptures, corrosion-resistant fittings for his ships, sharp tips for his arrows, and cutting edges for his swords and daggers. Bronze Age enabled civilization to thrive and war to become more deadly. To again repeat, metals as well as everything else except for mud, clay, and reeds had to be imported into Sumeria. Because Sumeria was the breadbasket of the ancient Near East, such things as grain, flax and wool clothing, dates, and woven goods could be used for barter. Because the trade routes were long and hazardous and the volume of goods to be shipped in wholesale lots was large, only the awalim, haves, could practice the import-export business. Smaller merchants worked for the wholesalers and in turn distributed goods through traveling agents and peddlers. Thus, the flow of profits were then, as they are today, always siphoned to the top. The highest profits were in foreign trade, where a monopoly of goods was maintained by the big merchants who could distribute through a family network of retail shops and traveling peddlers. Roads suitable for wagons were few. Long-distance traffic was usually conducted by donkeys carrying packs. Such donkey caravans could follow the most primitive paths and the narrowest mountain trails, allowing the merchants to penetrate to all of the outlying villages in the deepest mountains and the most distant oases. The length of a daily stage of a caravan was between 25 and 30 kilometers. The load of an individual donkey varied from 130 minas, 65 kilograms, to 150 minas, 75 kilograms. From these recorded data, we can estimate the times, distances, and quantities of goods that the ancient merchants could handle. Wagons were used for short hauls, such as transporting grain to local granaries. Farther north, in Upper Mesopotamia and in Syria, roads were more important than rivers and canals. Wagons were used for loads too bulky and heavy to be carried on donkey back. The ability to carry such heavy and unwieldy loads as logs of cedar, pine, and cypress over great distances on uneven terrain implied the maintenance of ancient wagon roads. As for building mountain roads for carrying lumber, even greater engineering skill was required. River traffic in Mesopotamia was always heavy. Cuneiform tablets record the transportation of grain, cattle, fish, milk, vegetables, oil, fruit, wool, stone, bricks, leather, and people over the network of canals, for which clay canal maps have been found. As early as the 3rd millennium BC, Mesopotamian sea-going ships sailed to distant lands for raw materials. Gold, copper, lapis lazuli, pearls called fish eyes, ivory and ivory objects such as combs, boxes, figurines, and furniture decorations, dates, and onions were traded. All of this because the business of the Sumerians, as they brought up farms and shops from the Ubaidian moneylenders and married into the Ubaidian moneylender families. Although Uruk was a larger city, drawing its wealth from the agricultural productivity of the soil, the city of Ur became more important for its trade links. Because of the less efficient and rough roads, traders transported large cargoes by water routes whenever possible. So, this should be remembered because it is important to the thesis of this history that all river shipping ended at Ur. From there, goods were packed on vessels that were able to navigate the bays and lagoons as far as the islands of Failaka and Bahrain. Thus, merchants of Ur had a particular advantage over the merchants of all other cities in Mesopotamia. It was from Ur that they were in contact with all of the cities of the Fertile Crescent, via the rivers and canals, as well as those lands reached by ship across the Persian Gulf: Dilmun, Bahrain; Magan, Oman; Melucca, the Indus Valley; the Arabian Peninsula; and the land of Punt, Somalia. P-U-N-T, Punt, Somalia. This far-ranging knowledge of distant lands gave the merchants of Ur a very important and unique perspective on not only trade but also on world events. The route around the Arabian Peninsula and into the Red Sea was navigated by 3000 BC. This early familiarity of the Awalam halves with all of those trade routes and all of those distant peoples so early in their history would be of continuing profit to them throughout the ages. Lengthy journeys were undertaken in the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and Persian Gulf in the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st millennia BC. Their ancient ships hugged the coasts and hopped from safe harbor to safe harbor only in the daylight hours, so trade was naturally controlled by whichever people controlled those harbors. Much of the shipping in the Persian Gulf was controlled by the Elamites, or Elamites, who could charge a tax for use of their harbors, Elamites. As the Bronze Age progressed, the merchants and moneylenders no longer were strictly attached to the temples or to the palace as paid middlemen, but they became independent businessmen with their own interests and investments. Certainly, both the temple and the palace employed underlings who managed the business of those institutions, but the Tamkarum, merchant moneylenders, as they would be called in later millennia, worked increasingly for their own private profits. Independent businessmen though they were, they could not do business without the king because the king offered protection throughout his territory. The king guaranteed diplomatic prestige and official introductions to foreign courts and to foreign cities outside of his territory. In return, the merchants and moneylenders offered the kings and the temple priests first choice of the best imports of foreign goods as well as political intelligence about foreign peoples. Intelligence is a polite way of saying the word spy. It should not be underestimated the high value that kings placed on the information that spies brought to them. Spying was not usually the merchant's primary reason for traveling to distant lands. However, the perfect disguise and alibi for a spy was as a traveling merchant because in those days merchants were always welcome in every community. Not so much in modern times, but most certainly in the ancient world. A trader or traveling merchant was always a unique and much admired visitor to every town both big and small. A caravan of pack asses was always an instant attraction to the slow and sleepy towns and villages of ancient times. Those strangers from distant lands always had new and unique things to sell or to barter, and if one was lucky enough to share a table with them at a public tavern over a pot of beer, amazing stories of distant places and fantastic goblins and strange creatures were sure to be traded in good fun. Or even if one was not lucky enough to hear the stories firsthand, the tavern keeper or the palace servants were sure to retell to their relatives and friends what they had overheard when the merchants were in audience with the king. Gossip was a primary way for information to be passed around in small communities. Who needs a telephone when all of the neighbors talk to one another? The ancient people were more advanced than we modern people in this respect, because in modern communities, neighbors no longer talk to neighbors, because they are all indoors watching the Jewish lies on television. Merely by not knowing their neighbors, modern people are less human than their own ancient forebears. The wealthiest moneylenders who invested in trade expeditions stayed safely at home, port managing their shops, their farms, their servants, and their various manufacturing industries. But their partners, the traveling merchants, did more than just barter and haggle and make profits. They were the eyes and ears of their business partners as well as of the king. The traveling merchants were the premier spies of the ancient Near East. They were spies who worked equally for both sides in politics and in secret for themselves alone. As merchant spies, they sold goods and information to whomever had the silver, while they used their spy networks to enrich themselves. This spying function of the ancient merchants has been very much overlooked by modern archaeologists and historians. Perhaps the historians think that the kings and armies of the ancient Near East went out blindly to war without scouting out the territory first, or that they would risk thirst and starvation without knowing where the wells and oases were located, or that entire countries would clash in war spontaneously and without diplomatic reason or without military planning. So it is a bit odd for the historians and archaeologists to overlook this, but no matter, let's look into this ourselves. Merchants have always had a unique position among all peoples, most especially among the ancient peoples. They were strangers and foreigners who brought unique and interesting goods from far places. In a time when daily life moved as leisurely as a walking ox, and the peaceful silence of the countryside pressed in even to the small cities, there was not a lot of excitement other than the local festivals, wedding parties, or religious events. And such events were of a well-known nature, having the same songs and prayers performed by the same groups of neighbors, priests, and leaders, just as it had always been, for as long as anybody could remember. Life was slow-paced and tranquil. It was a tranquility unknown by modern people who are surrounded by the noise of automobile traffic, jets flying overhead, and the blare of amplified modern noise that passes for music. Nature is filled with peacefulness, and the ancient peoples lived within the peacefulness of nature. But when foreign traders rode into town or village with their pack trains of donkeys in tow, now that was something extraordinary. Who were these dust-covered strangers with their pack donkeys and carts loaded with boxes and bundles and accompanied by fierce-looking guards armed with spears and swords, maces, bows, and arrows? What kinds of rare and delightful goods did they bring with them? What news did they bring? What amazing stories would they tell of their adventures? What stories would they tell to those fortunate ones who could hear them firsthand? Stories that would then be repeated countless times from mouth to eager ears to the farthest shepherds in the outback. Yes, the traders were a very welcome change to the dull routine of agrarian life throughout all of the ancient lands. Although these merchants traveled quietly so as to attract the least attention possible from bandits, they were not at all quiet when they entered a town or into the district of a city-state. Then they wanted as much attention and business as possible. So drums and trumpets and horns, tambourines, and the loud cries of the carnival barker announced to one and to all that the merchants had arrived with items to sell. Aggressive self-promotion was a timeless attribute of these merchants and salesmen, but it took another 2,000 years of self-aggrandizement before these merchant moneylender scoundrels developed what is known as chutzpah, or insolent audacity, as a necessary step toward enshrining themselves as the greatest show on earth and the very apple of God's eye. Even when the trade goods had only been obsidian blades and obsidian cores carried laboriously from the northern regions around Lake Van, the traders had always been welcomed even during the earliest Stone Age times. They brought new things that could not have been obtained without their efforts or without traveling long distances as a trader oneself. And they brought news from distant places and from over the horizon. In every sleepy hamlet, the traveling merchants and traders had always had a special welcome. But even if they ran into hostile tribes, they were protected by their special merchant's threat. They threatened to never come back with any more trade goods if their stuff was stolen. Since they also carried the special letters and seals of safe passage of the various kings, it was only the most remote and barbaric tribes that they had to fear. And for those, they usually had their own escort troops as well as the troops of the king to protect them as far as the next kingdom's borders. The merchants have always been a specially protected class in society. They were a class that both the rich and the poor were eager to welcome. They enjoyed and valued, indeed, they demanded special treatment and special protection because it brought them so much prestige, profits, and personal safety. When the merchants came riding into town on their donkeys with horns blaring and drums pounding, it was with an air of confident bravery and customer inveigling mystery. Customer inveigling mystery amid the clamor and noise. Whether striding confidently through a town square beside their pack animals or presenting some rarity before the throne of a king, the Tamkarum, merchant moneylenders, learned the importance of prestige. They were instant celebrities whether they went, not because of any virtue of their own, but because of the trade goods and wondrous stories that they carried. It was this belief that these ordinary retailers actually possessed something to be envied or admired that gave them prestige in the eyes of the locals. With high prestige, they could demand higher prices. Always a quick student in sizing up a customer, the Tamkarum, merchant moneylenders, realized the reverse psychology of this sales technique. By striking certain noble poses and attitudes and by assuming certain authoritative tones of voice, these petty hustlers found that their prestige could be raised and their profits increased simply by pretending to be more than they were. It was with this insolent audacity, this chutzpah of pretending to possess what they did not have, that the Tamkarum, merchant moneylenders, developed secret fraud number 19. Prestige is a glittering robe for ennobling treason and blinding fools. The more it is used, the more it profits he who dresses in it. But mainly, it was the wealthier members of society who benefited from the traders and their cargoes. Imported goods were more expensive than local manufactures, since they were unobtainable anywhere else, and the cost of importing them added to the amount that the traders would ask. So, the average people could not afford them. Since the smaller items often brought the highest prices, such as gems and jewels, spices, incense, perfume, oils, artistically crafted gold and silver items, these could be safely hidden among the more ordinary goods such as fine linen and wool garments, or brass cups and copper pots, or at the bottom of grain sacks. Merchants always had an audience with the kings and ministers simply because of the goods that they offered. The more costly and rare items, in addition to their high profit margins, were useful as bribes to officials or to tribal leaders, or as a means of ingratiating themselves to the kings. The kings and their ministers were always eager to buy expensive luxury goods as gifts for favored wives and as symbols of personal wealth, status, and power. Thus, it was from the palace of kings and ministers that the merchants expected their greatest rewards for the small and expensive items. Even better, since the import items had cost them very little at their places of origin. These deceiving merchants could bribe the kings and ministers cheaply, gaining great business and political influence from grateful administrators and generals with expensive gifts that had cost them paltry sums. The merchants also brought news and gossip. In the taverns they told amazing stories of foreign peoples, tales spiced with awesome adventures, and stories of fantastic creatures, ghosts, monsters, and acts of the gods. All, of course, totally unprovable, but since no one could say otherwise, their fabulous stories could not be anything other than true. And like any story told for the satisfaction of seeing the wide eyes and awestruck faces of their listeners, the merchants were masters of fabricating whatever most pleased themselves and astounded their audience. This is the way of all merchants from the most ancient times. Telling stories was a part of the merchants' craft. Like any salesman from every age, fanciful stories and droll fibs helped him to sell his goods in the market. Telling stories also added to his skills for deceit, that is, knowing just how much could be told so as to be believed, but not saying too much so as to lose the sale. I'll take a swig here. The merchants told stories to impress the local fools and to elevate their own heroism and prestige in the eyes of the local populace. They told stories that advertised the rarity of their costly wares, and through giant dust storms, horrible monsters, sheets of lightning, bands of robbers, floods and earthquakes, the great difficulty in delivering them to such lucky buyers. Such stories made them greater profits without greater expenses. There were stories for demeaning and lowering the price asked for the trade goods that the locals wanted to sell. And there were stories proving to the seller that the merchant was doing them a favor to buy or trade from them at such low prices because, after all, the poor merchant would barely be able to resell those goods in distant lands. Such stories and prevarications made for them greater profits while costing them nothing more than hot air. Merchants and salesmen have always used plenty of hot air and flapping lips to sell their goods because it has always been this way. And there were the stories reserved solely for the king and his counselors, stories that contained information about surrounding armies, the personnel of distant courts, the peaceful or warlike dispositions of those kings, the logistics and locations of food and water supplies for distant kingdoms, and the walled cities and the relative wealth of those places. No one could judge the relative wealth of a country as well as could a merchant whose greedy eyes take in such knowledge at a glance, and no one could penetrate the palaces of distant kings as could a merchant whose presence was welcomed and encouraged and who allegedly had only a commercial reason for being there. Merchants were not suspected of anything other than the buying and selling of goods. Even if they were suspected of spying, it could not be proven, and though the kings could make good use of them for gathering intelligence, they could not force them to divulge this intelligence with other than politeness and benevolence accompanied by sumptuous banquets and entertainments. So the greedy merchants of the ancient Near East became a favored confidant of many kings. With their skills of giving rare presents to court ministers and scribes, with their skills of deceit and bargaining for advantage, with their skills of inventing tales of every description, the merchants and moneylenders were able to gather from each kingdom more than what the king of that kingdom would have wanted them to gather. Some secrets were for the common peasant. Some secrets were only for the ears of kings. Among themselves, however, the merchants kept their very own secrets. Secrets of how and where to find the best deals and to sell for the best prices. Secrets that they and their sons and their immediate trade partners knew. These were the ordinary secrets that all merchants keep among themselves. But there was more. The merchants discovered that in addition to the Sumerian Swindle, they, and only they, knew more about distant places than anyone else. The Tamkarum, merchant moneylenders, began to realize that through their trade networks they could foresee events and influence politics from over the horizon. The majority of the people of 3000 BC rarely traveled more than a day's walk from where they were born, and they lived in those confined localities for their entire lives. The majority of the kings of the various city-states did not travel much either. Their use of donkeys and ox carts, and later their use of horses and chariots, allowed them to travel around their kingdoms. But travel of more than a few 20s of kilometers for the smaller kingdoms and 100 kilometers for the larger kingdoms was rare. And even in later times when the Sumerian, Assyrian, Egyptian, and Persian kings extended their kingdoms throughout the Near East, from Mediterranean to Persian seas, even then, among all of these people from lowly servant to highest king, no one knew more about distant lands than did the merchants and traders. Traveling, bartering, sightseeing, and profiting from the people around them was all a part of their business. No matter how big any of the kingdoms that existed in the ancient world were, the trade routers that crisis-crossed those kingdoms were far wider and far longer. From the most distant Paleolithic times, where traders carried obsidian blades and cores along footpaths, up to our modern-day world of giant container ships and jumbo jets carrying millions of tons of goods, the trade routes have always been larger in size than the borders of any country. It says that, but should be larger in size than the borders of any country. Thus the merchants and moneylenders kept a secret belief among themselves. That secret belief was this: because we Tamkarum, merchant moneylenders, have knowledge of distant places that is greater than the kings and far greater than the people, then we, Tamkarum, merchant moneylenders, are greater than the kings, and we are far greater than the people. And that ends that subchapter and this recording. We'll pick back up with the kings of ancient times.